The city never truly slept, but some corners of it seemed to dream. At 3 in the morning, Daniel Foster sat by the wide glass window of his apartment, looking down at the scattered lights of cars moving like fireflies beneath the drizzle. His reflection, a man in his mid-30s with tired eyes, a suit jacket half folded on the chair, and a phone still glowing with unread messages, stared back at him. He had made it. Or at least, that's what everyone said. A name in the papers, a face at conferences, a CEO before 40. The kind of person his younger self would have idolized, driven, decisive, unshakable. But behind the awards and the polite applause, Daniel had built his success on a silent kind of loss. The kind that followed him everywhere like a shadow that never aged. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the missed calls. There were 3 from his assistant, 1 from his board partner, and 1 from his sister, marked from home. He didn't have to guess why. His father's health had been declining for months. Daniel had promised to visit. He had promised 100 times. Instead, he kept postponing meetings, flights, deadlines, deals. Each time, the excuse sounded different, but meant the same. Not now. I'll come later. There's still time. The sound of the rain against the window felt heavier than usual, as if the night was reminding him that time didn't wait for people like him. Daniel had grown up in the small coastal town of Whitestone, the kind of place where the sea wind carried salt and memories. And everyone knew each other's names. His father, George Foster, owned a small repair shop, and his mother, Helen, was a teacher at the local school. They hadn't had much, but they had something that Daniel didn't even understand until much later. Peace. He remembered the mornings when his father would wake him before sunrise to help in the shop. The smell of oil and sawdust mixing with coffee. George never said much, but his silence carried lessons stronger than any advice. Fix what you can, he'd say, handing Daniel a rusted tool. And if it can't be fixed, at least understand why. At 17, Daniel had left Whitestone for college, chasing something bigger than the sea and the stars. His parents had watched him go, proud but afraid. He had promised he'd never forget where he came from. But ambition, like a tide, had a way of pulling everything back into the deep. Now, decades later, that same tide had returned, but instead of salt water, it brought guilt. Daniel leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. His apartment was too quiet. The walls were white, spotless, lifeless. Like a hotel room someone forgot to check out of. On his desk sat a framed photo. Him, his sister Lily, and their parents at the pier. His father had one arm around Daniel's shoulder, the other holding Lily's hand. Daniel was barely smiling, caught mid-blink, impatient to grow up, to leave, to become something more. That he reached for the frame, but stopped midway. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily. Dad's condition got worse tonight. Please come tomorrow. He's asking for you. Daniel stared at it for a long moment. Then he typed, I'll try. I have meetings in the morning. He didn't send it. He didn't delete it either. He just locked the phone and leaned his head back, staring at the ceiling as if answers might fall from there. Morning came like a slow confession. The alarm buzzed, the coffee brewed, and the city began its endless performance again. Cars, horns, footsteps, voices. Daniel dressed in his usual precision, gray suit, blue tie, polished shoes. Success had a uniform, and he wore it like armor. At the office, he was greeted with smiles that meant nothing. His assistant, Monica, ran through the schedule. Investors at 10, a press briefing at noon, dinner with clients at 8. Everything important. Everything that couldn't wait. Except maybe the one thing that should have. He nodded through meetings, spoke eloquently, negotiated, smiled for photos. The entire day passed in a blur of artificial purpose. But in the back of his mind, Lily's message echoed like a heartbeat he couldn't silence. At 9:43 p.m. When the city lights began to flicker through the rain again, Daniel finally packed his laptop. His flight to Whitestone was at 6 a.m. He'd go, stay one day, then return before the next quarterly call. That was the plan, efficient, logical, detached. But logic meant little when the universe decided otherwise. At 2:17 a.m., his phone rang. He didn't need to look at the screen to know. Daniel. Lily's voice was trembling, broken. He's gone. The silence that followed wasn't silence at all. It was 1,000 unspoken words collapsing at once. Every missed call, every postponed visit, every later that never came. Daniel pressed a hand to his mouth, but the breath wouldn't come. The apartment around him suddenly felt too large, too empty. He stood there, staring at the skyline, watching the reflection of his own success blur behind the glass. The city didn't care. It never did. The funeral was quiet. The sky over Whitestone was gray, the air heavy with salt and wind. Lily stood beside him, pale, holding a folded piece of paper, their father's handwriting on the last note he had left. Don't forget to fix what's broken. Daniel didn't cry. Not at the graveside, not during the eulogy, not when the people left and only seagulls remained. He stood there long after everyone had gone, the rain soaking through his coat, and whispered, "I'm sorry." But the sea didn't answer. That night, Daniel stayed in his childhood home, a small wooden house that still smelled faintly of oil and old books. Everything was exactly as it had been. The clock ticking unevenly on the wall, the faded curtains his mother had sewn, the marks on the doorframe measuring his and Lily's heights that he walked into the garage, where the repair shop tools still hung neatly on the wall. The workbench was covered in dust. On it lay a small wooden box, unfinished, half-sanded, the last thing his father had worked on. Daniel sat down and ran his hand over it. The wood felt rough, but warm. Inside, he found a folded letter addressed to him. "Son, I know you're busy. You've always been. That's who you are. I just hope one day you'll stop long enough to see what you've built. Not the company, not the name, but the life around you. That's the only thing worth fixing." The words blurred before Daniel could finish reading. For the first time in years, he cried. Not the kind of tears that came from sadness alone, but from the realization of how far he had gone from himself. Outside, the rain began to fall again, steady, cleansing, almost merciful that he didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at the old table, staring at the letter, tracing each line with his thumb as if it could somehow erase the distance he had created. When dawn finally broke, the world outside looked softer. Whitestone hadn't changed. The same waves, the same quiet streets, but Daniel had. Something inside him had cracked, and for the first time, he wasn't trying to fix it, he simply let it hurt. And somewhere between the pain and the morning light, a decision began to form. Not in his head, but in his heart. He was going to rebuild what he had lost. But redemption, he would soon learn, was never a single act. It was a long road. And sometimes, you had to walk it barefoot through everything you'd broken along the way. The morning after the funeral, Whitestone seemed caught between silence and memory. The sky was a soft gray, the kind that blurred the horizon until sea and air became one. Daniel stood by the shore, his shoes sinking slightly into the wet sand. The wind tugged at his coat, carrying the familiar scent of salt and engine oil from the docks. For years, he had dreamed of escaping this place. Now, he wasn't sure he wanted to leave at all. His sister Lily joined him quietly. She was holding 2 mugs of coffee, one chipped, one new. She handed him the chipped one. "Dad always said coffee tastes better when you drink it by the sea," she said with a faint smile. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He was right. They stood together for a long time, listening to the waves. There wasn't much left to say. Grief had a way of swallowing words. But beneath the quiet, there was something unspoken between them. Years of distance, resentment, and misunderstanding, all wrapped in love that had never really disappeared. Lily broke the silence first. "So what now?" Daniel looked out toward the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe I should stay for a while. Help around the house. Fix some things." She smiled faintly. "You? Fixing things?" He almost laughed. "Yeah, I guess that's new for me." The days that followed moved slower than any Daniel had known in years. There were no meetings, no deadlines, no traffic or polished suits, only quiet mornings, creaking floorboards, and the hum of old memories. He began spending hours in the garage, sorting through his father's tools, restoring machines that hadn't been touched in years. It felt strange at first, working with his hands instead of a keyboard. But soon, it became almost meditative, a way of reconnecting with something real. Each sound, the scrape of sandpaper, the hiss of oil, the click of gears, carried him back to his childhood. To the mornings when his father would hum under his breath while tightening a bolt. To the nights when Daniel would fall asleep on a workbench, dreaming of skyscrapers and success. But now, success looked different. He began walking through the town again, past the bakery where Mrs. Doyle still sold the same sugar rolls. past the pier where fishermen mended their nets, past the school where his mother used to teach. People recognized him, greeted him, asked about his company, his life in the city. He smiled politely, but his answers were short. He was realizing that somewhere along the way, the man he had become had stopped belonging anywhere. One afternoon, Daniel found Lily sitting in the kitchen, sorting through old letters and photographs. The table was covered in moments: birthdays, graduations, family dinners, all frozen in fading color. She picked up one photo, Daniel at 23, standing with their father in front of the shop, both of them grinning, covered in grease. "You remember this?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "That was the day we fixed the old generator. Dad said it would never work again, and you proved him wrong." He smiled. "Yeah." He pretended to be annoyed, but I think he was proud. Lily leaned back in her chair. "He was. He always was, Danny. Even when you stopped calling as much." The words hit softly but deep. "I know," he said quietly. "I thought I was doing it all for him. For both of you. I thought if I made it big enough, it would make him proud." Lily looked at him with sad eyes. "He didn't want your success, Dan. He wanted your time." Silence stretched between them again. But this time, it wasn't cold. It was healing, in a slow, painful kind of way. In the evenings, Daniel started walking to the pier. He'd sit at the edge, watching the light fade over the water. The waves reminded him of time. Endless, patient, and unstoppable. Sometimes he'd talk out loud. To no one. To his father. To himself. "I missed so much," he'd whisper. And for what? He thought about the people he'd stepped over to climb higher. The relationships he'd abandoned. The nights spent staring at screens instead of faces. He had traded warmth for applause, and now, the applause had stopped, leaving only echoes. But redemption, he was learning, wasn't about punishment. It was about presence. He began helping Lily around town, fixing the fence, repairing the leaking roof, volunteering at the community center his father once donated tools to. Each small act was like a thread, stitching back a connection he hadn't realized was torn. And slowly, people began to see a different Daniel. Not the CEO, but the son, the neighbor, the man who stayed after everyone else had left. Weeks turned into months. The town shifted from winter gray to spring sunlight. Whitestone began to feel alive again, and so did Daniel. One morning, he drove out to the cliffs overlooking the sea, the same spot where his father used to take him to watch the sunrise. The view hadn't changed. The waves still broke against the rocks in perfect rhythm. The wind still carried the same scent of salt and grass. He stood there for a long time, thinking about the letter his father had left him. "Stop long enough to see what you've built. Not the company, but the life." For the first time, he felt like he understood what that meant. He had built something huge, but hollow. And now, he wanted to build something smaller, but real. One day, Lily came into the garage holding her phone. "You're trending again," she said, half teasing. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What for?" "Someone from the company leaked that you turned down a major merger deal. They're calling it a crisis." He smiled faintly. "Let them. Maybe they'll find someone better. You're really not going back." He paused. "Maybe someday. But not now. Not until I know who I am without it." Lily watched him for a moment, then nodded. Dad would have liked that answer. Later that night, Daniel sat at his father's old desk, writing for the first time in years. Not emails, not contracts, just words. Thoughts that he wrote about Whitestone, about his father, about what success cost him, and what he had finally found in losing it. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But that didn't matter. Writing it was enough. It was his way of fixing something that couldn't be fixed any other way. One weekend, as he was repairing the wooden box his father had left unfinished, a young boy appeared at the door. He couldn't have been more than 10, carrying a broken bicycle. "Mr. Foster? My mom said you can fix anything." Daniel smiled, surprised by the title. "I can try." He spent the next hour helping the boy patch the tire and straighten the handlebars. When they finished, the kid grinned wide. "Thanks, Mr. Foster. My dad never has time for stuff like this." Daniel froze for just a second, then smiled softly. "Make sure you ride it carefully." As the boy pedaled away, Daniel felt something stir deep inside. Not guilt this time, but warmth. The kind that came from doing something simple, something right. Maybe this was what his father meant all along. That evening, Daniel sat by the window again, just like in the city, but the view was different. Instead of glass towers, he saw the flickering lights of boats in the harbor. Instead of traffic, he heard laughter from the nearby houses. He realized he hadn't felt this alive in years. For the first time in his adult life, he didn't have a plan. And that, strangely, felt like freedom. As he looked at the half-finished box on the table, the thought came to him suddenly, like a whisper carried on the wind. Maybe it was time to start building again, not for profit, not for legacy, but for love, and deep down, he knew his father would have smiled at that. The summer came quietly to Whitestone. The harbor shimmered with gold each morning, and the days stretched longer, warmer, softer. By then, Daniel had grown used to the rhythm of this place. The hum of engines at dawn, the chatter of fishermen, the laughter echoing from the old boardwalk. He had stopped wearing his watch months ago. Time didn't matter much here. Every morning, he'd wake early, make coffee in the same dented pot his father once used, and sit on the porch watching the sunlight creep across the sea. Sometimes Lily would join him, sometimes not. Silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt earned. He wasn't the same man who had left the city. That man had lived on schedules, profits, and headlines. This one lived on moments, the small, unremarkable kind that somehow meant everything. It started with one idea. The garage, with its cracked walls and dust-covered tools, had once been the heartbeat of their father's life, a place where broken things were made whole again. One evening, Daniel stood inside it and thought, why not bring it back? Not as a business, not the way he used to build things for money, but as a place to teach others what his father had taught him: patience, precision, pride. He reopened the old workshop, repainted the walls, cleaned every shelf. Lily helped him file the old invoices and reorganize the shelves of bolts, screws, and faded manuals. A few of the local kids wandered in out of curiosity, then stayed out of fascination. Daniel started teaching them how to fix small engines, how to use a wrench, how to listen to the quiet music of machinery coming back to life. At first, he thought of it as a simple community project, but soon, he realized it was something far more profound. Every time a boy or girl managed to fix something, their eyes lit up the same way as had, all those years ago. It was as if the workshop itself had remembered what it once was: a sanctuary of effort and creation, a place where love and work were the same thing. One evening, as he was locking up, Lily leaned against the doorframe and smiled. "Dad would have loved this," she said softly. Daniel looked around at the dusty shelves and humming lights. "Yeah," he murmured. "I think he's here somewhere." A few weeks later, he received a letter in the mail from the company he had left behind. They wanted him to come back. Not as CEO this time, but as a consultant, to guide a new generation, to help redefine what leadership meant after his departure. The irony almost made him laugh. He took the letter to the pier and sat for a long while, turning it over in his hands. There was a time when he would have signed instantly, when the idea of being needed, admired, sought after, would have filled him with pride. But now, all he felt was a quiet uncertainty. He didn't need saving anymore. And maybe the company didn't either. Still, a small part of him wondered if he could do both. Carry what he'd learned here into the world he'd once left behind. He didn't answer the letter right away. He just watched the waves. That night, he dreamt of his father again. Not as the tired old man he'd last seen, but as he remembered him from childhood. Strong, laughing, smelling faintly of oil and sea breeze. They stood together in the workshop, surrounded by light. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do now," Daniel said in the dream. His father smiled. "You already know, son. You just don't trust yourself yet." Daniel frowned. "But what if I fail again?" "Then fail better," his father said, still smiling. "That's all any of us can do." When he woke, the words lingered. Fail better. It wasn't about success anymore. It was about growth, about having the courage to begin again, even when you knew how easily things could fall apart. Over the next months, Daniel began traveling between Whitestone and the city, balancing two lives that once seemed impossible to coexist. He kept the workshop running with Lily's help, mentoring a handful of teenagers who looked up to him the way he once looked up to his father. And a few days each week, he'd drive into the city, not to conquer it this time, but to help it heal. He started teaching at the company's leadership program, talking not about profit margins or strategy, but about values, humility, and the danger of forgetting why you began. At first, some executives rolled their eyes. But slowly, something changed. People listened. They began to talk more about purpose, less about power. The air in those boardrooms started to shift. One day, a young employee approached him after a seminar. "Mr. Foster," she said, "you talk about failure like it's not the end of the world." He smiled. "Because it's not. Sometimes it's the only way we start really living." Months passed. The company began implementing new programs, mentorships, mental health initiatives, flexible hours for parents. Daniel didn't take credit for any of it, but he watched quietly as small changes began to ripple outward. In Whitestone, the workshop grew into something of its own legend. Parents sent their kids there to learn skills, but what they really learned was patience and pride, lessons that could never be taught in classrooms. Lily often teased him that he'd finally become their father, gruff, stubborn, and always covered in grease. Daniel would laugh, but deep down, he knew it was true. He had become the man he once misunderstood. One autumn evening, after a long day at the workshop, Daniel drove back to the cliffs. The sky was painted in the deep oranges of sunset, and the sea glowed like molten glass. He sat on the hood of his truck and watched the light fade. That he thought about how life had brought him full circle, from a restless sun chasing the horizon to a man who had finally learned how to stay still, and he realized something that made him smile through the quiet ache in his chest. He hadn't returned to the past. He had built something new from it. A bridge between generations. A home that wasn't made of walls, but of lessons. Later that night, he sat with Lily on the porch. She was knitting, he was sipping tea, both lost in the comfort of silence. "You ever think about Dad?" he asked softly. "All the time," she said, "but not the way I used to. It doesn't hurt as much anymore." "Yeah," he said. "Me too." Lily looked at him. You turned out okay, Danny." He chuckled. "Took me long enough." She smiled. "The good things always do." That winter, snow came early to Whitestone. The harbor froze in patches, and the town grew quiet again. But for Daniel, the quiet no longer meant emptiness. One afternoon, as he closed up the workshop, he noticed the boy with the bicycle again, now taller, older, with a shy grin. "Hey, Mr. Foster," the boy said. "Guess what? What's that?" "I got accepted into an engineering program. Wanted to say thanks." Daniel's throat tightened. "You did all the work, kid." The boy grinned. "Maybe, but you taught me how not to give up when things break." When the boy left, Daniel stood there for a while, watching the snow fall through the light of the open door. His father's wrench still hung on the wall, the same one he'd refused to throw away. He took it down, held it for a moment, and smiled. "Guess we fixed more than engines, huh, Dad?" Spring returned again, and the world kept turning. The company thrived under new leadership. The workshop expanded into a foundation. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, stopped searching for what came next. He had learned that the most beautiful parts of life weren't the moments of triumph, but the quiet, steady ones that followed, when you finally stopped running and realized you were already home. One evening, as he walked down to the water, the sunset painted everything in gold. The sea shimmered like a mirror, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw his father's reflection in the light. He didn't say anything. He just smiled and whispered, "Thank you." And as the tide rolled in, the world felt still, peaceful, complete, because some lights, once lit, never really go out.